Right now, we are seeing an unwinding of the Obama administration's overtures of friendship to Cuba. Investigations into acoustic attacks on U.S. diplomatic staff working on the island, Cuban diplomatic staff sent away from the U.S., travel restrictions from the State Department put in place, and more to come. It does not bode well for tourism and business in Cuba, but there may be a bright spot on the horizon. Please welcome Vito Echevarria, a journalist and writer for CubaStandard.com. Sir, thank you so much for joining me. Let's talk about oil. Cuba Oil Union, it produces at least 4 million tons a year, hasn't found new reserves since 2002. A lot of people say it's still out there. Australia's Havana energy company estimates there could be up to 8 billion barrels in potential oil reserves. If this oil is found, what does it mean for Cuba?
Well, yeah, it certainly would be a game changer if Cuba does find significant amount of oil offshore. As you may have heard, the U.S. Geological Survey back in the early 2000s were the one that came out with this report asserting that there's a lot of oil off the north, and particularly the northwest coast of Cuba, which faces the Gulf of Mexico and South Florida. The only problem with all that is you've had oil companies who have already done exploration efforts, such as Petrobras from Brazil, Petronas from Malaysia, and also Repsol from Spain. These particular oil companies have done exploration efforts and have failed so far. The reason for this conference that was held recently in Havana, the reason why it was held in the first place by the Cuban state oil company Cuba, is to let the world know that Cuba is still very much interested in finding that oil and is looking for whomever it needs to talk to in order to make that happen, even American oil companies.
Okay, but what about Venezuela? Because for years, Venezuela sent supplies like oil to Cuba, big partners there, big allies. If more oil is found and discovered in Cuba, how does the shift of balance take place? There's a balance of power going on there that's just going to completely skew that.
Right. As you know, when Hugo Chavez was still alive and kicking, he struck a deal with Fidel Castro, a sweetheart deal to provide oil to Cuba somewhere in the area of at least 100,000 barrels a day to the island, because the island consumes at least 130,000 barrels a day. So, during the so-called wonder years of relations between Venezuela and Cuba, it was doing that. But obviously, because of the recent crisis, political crisis in Caracas, Venezuela currently supplies a fraction of that, somewhere in the area of 50 to 55,000 barrels a day of oil. So Cuba has to make up for a shortcoming, so it's had to turn to its old friends such as Russia to fill in the gap. Obviously, Cuba's aim is still to be energy independent, which is why it's still looking for future oil drilling partners to make itself energy efficient in the future. Once that does happen, obviously it's going to be a huge change in relations between Cuba and Venezuela. Cuba will no longer need Venezuela for its energy needs.
Right, and Venezuela's hit out at Cuba for this. Not happy at all. Rosneft, Russian oil giant, is getting very cozy, as you pointed out. Australia, as we mentioned earlier, what sort of a vacuum are we dealing with right now?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, there is that gap that the Russians are, for the time being, filling. But the relationship cannot last forever because it's not the same terms of trade as with Venezuela. I mean, so, obviously the goal for Cuba is to, find its own oil at some point. So it does have the Australian company known as Melbana. They currently have a concession to drill at an onshore site, which is somewhere just east of the resort town of Varadero. But even if, there's a significant find there, the belief is still that there's even more significant potential find of oil off the north and especially the northwest coast of the island.
I want to go back to something that you said last year with regard to Donald Trump, President Donald Trump's tweets and his statements, rather explosive statements about Cuba. You had mentioned back then he was rather new to the presidency at the time, and you said, maybe don't take what he's saying too strong, taking it with a grain of salt. What do you think now, based on the changes you've seen in that time?
Well, a lot of individuals are perplexed as to why Trump is taking the current position that he is with Cuba, which is, very hawkish and is turning the clock back a good 30 years. Many say that, basically Trump struck a deal with Senator Marco Rubio and Congressman Diaz-Balart to take that position, as opposed to the American business community's positions, which are a lot more practical. That is, there's a lot to be gained in engaging, doing business with Cuba. Obviously, the real issue is, what is the position of the U.S. petroleum companies, such as Exxon and Mobil, among others? You know, their position seems to be a wait-and-see game, in which if a third country, a third-party oil company does find a significant amount of oil there, that perhaps they will pressure Trump into taking a more conciliatory, more positive stance toward Cuba.
So you might, you're pointing out we might see a backtracking on Twitter then. Okay, thank you so much for your great input on this. Vito Echevarria, journalist and writer for CubaStandard.com.